Wij bidden voor vrede en voeren tegelijkertijd oorlog. Voor de jezuïet Gerard Hughes is dat tekenend voor onze gespleten vorm van spiritualiteit. Ik ontmoet hem in een van de colleges van Oxford in Campion Hall, waar hij studeerde. Nadien ging hij op pelgrimstocht naar Rome en Jeruzalem en schreef tal van boeken, onder andere God in All Things. Gerard Hughes, welcome to the interview. You came to Oxford to study here at Campion Hall. You were a student. What did you study?
I studied the dead languages. I studied Latin and Greek. And the first 5 terms were just studying the literature. And the remaining 7 terms are studying philosophy and ancient history.
You started a training program for Jesuits, which was open to Catholic, Protestants and pagans.
Yes.
And what did you learn from them, or what did they learn from you?
Well, what they learned from me is they know, but I certainly learned a lot from them. And it was this whole thing of God, people who are honestly seeking the truth. And in that first meeting with the communists, there was one wonderful man, and he had been at Cambridge studying Italian. I think he was with Thomas Merton, about the same year. And he was influenced by, because there was communist influence going on at that time, you know, and I think he was being drawn to them. But he was also studying Dante's Divine Comedy. And he was drawn to the Catholic Church. So he went to the chaplain and he was told that his reading matter was all wrong and he wasn't really suitable to be a Catholic. That's what he said. Whether it's true or not, another question. But at any rate, he then packed his bags, he left Cambridge and he went and fought in the Spanish War for the communists.
Did he?
Then later, this was in the early 1980s, he read the documents of the Second Vatican Council, he realized the way it had changed, and he became a Roman Catholic. And he was still working in the Russian embassy. And he was a wonderful, open man, but a real seeker after truth. I thought, God is at work in everyone. And I thought, there's an example of it.
But do all seekers end up in finding an answer? Do they all discover God or the truth at the end of their journey?
In general, I would say no, but that would also include believers. I mean, I believe in God, but it's the nature of God. It's not as though you found God and now you can sit back and say how wrong everyone else is. Because this is the nature of God. God draws us all the time into truth, and it can never be fully explored. We can never adequately know God. But God is, as it were, that which is most close to us, and on the other hand, the most mysterious in our lives. And Augustine put it in those beautiful words, God is closer to me than I am to me. And yet God can never be exhausted. It's a constant movement towards God. It's not a, you've got the answer now. And that's why that whole question of faith, what is faith? Mm-hmm. Faith is not answers to questions.
How would you define faith?
I wouldn't try. I would describe what I now understand as faith. And faith is that reality, God is. Now, if you ask me now, how do you understand God? I don't know how I understand God. I mean, I can give descriptions. I can say, well, that's not God, that's not God, that's not God. But I can't define God, but God is real. And things can be very, very real to us, and yet we can't get a definition for them. can we define what love is? Well, you may know what love is, but you can't define it, can't put it into words. And faith, I think, is an attitude to our surroundings, and the belief that in all that I see and hear and touch and taste, there's this presence of God which is more like something which permeates, is like air or sea, as though we're in the ocean and we're worrying one another and saying, where exactly is God? As we go swimming around. And you say, well, God is. I mean, otherwise you couldn't be swimming. And that notion that somehow the facts, however deplorable they may be to us, are in some way kind. And I believe that's what the meaning, ultimate meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection, that he's entered into our darkness, into our sinfulness, into death itself, and is risen. And it's why he keeps saying in the gospel to people, your faith has saved you, go in peace.
What does that mean? I mean, your faith has saved you.
Well, what it doesn't mean, it can't mean, is simply you recite a creed and that saved you. It's not that. Creeds have their place, but they're not the primary object of faith. The primary object of faith is God. God is. And it's somehow the trusting that no matter what the facts may be, how put it, there's a benevolence in it all. And the facts, however hideous, they're not the end. Now you say philosophically, how do you prove that? I can't.
But the facts can be very cruel.
The facts can be extremely
there's
cruel.
There's war, there's torture.
Yes, yes.
Facts are not kind.
The facts are not kind, but again, it's with what sort of perception one sees it. The crucifixion was not kind, it was utterly brutal. And right through the scripture is this business of God working out of disaster, brutality. For example, in the creation accounts, and the church singing on Holy Saturday, "Oh, happy sin of Adam." I mean, however you explain that.
Felix culpa. Felix culpa.
Felix culpa.
Felix
Oh,
culpa.
happy sin.
Yes.
And again, in things like the story of Joseph in Egypt. Joseph chucked down the well. Years later, Joseph's made it good in Egypt. His brothers who chucked him down the well are starving. They come to Egypt. They think that Joseph is dead. Joseph's in charge of food supplies. And eventually Joseph says to the brothers, you thought to do me evil, but God has turned it all to good account. And God, as it were, working through the evil, through the mess. And faith is the belief that in all things, in the beautiful, the wonderful things, the awe-inspiring things, yes, God is there. And it's sort of relatively easy to accept that. But to see that God's in the mess and the chaos, that is much more difficult to see. But you have so much evidence from people who've been through the awful darkness.
You made 2 pilgrimages, one to Rome, one to Jerusalem. Yes. Can you tell us about it? What would you call at the heart of a pilgrimage?
The heart of the pilgrimage, it was... Now this was a reflection later, but I recognize it as true. Somebody had written that people who go on long journeys, go on pilgrimages, they're going for a reason which they may not be conscious of at the time. They're aware of the complexity of human life, the difficulty of finding direction, finding meaning. And so what they do is they play out this puzzle by choosing a particular place to go to. And that corresponds to insiders. What's the object of my life? What am I trying to do? Where am I trying to get to? And somehow through doing it in the pilgrimage style, you learn a whole lot of things about life, which you knew before in theory, but through the walking, you learn it at a deeper level.
What did you learn at the deeper level?
Well, for example, the importance of your destination, of where do you really want to get to, and realizing on the Rome walk, I passed through lovely places, people invited me to stay, etc. And all my decisions were, well, I want to get to Rome on foot. So I would refuse lifts, wouldn't stay at a place for too long because it would break up the schedule, etc. And seeing that in life, what really is your destination? And seeing, for example, the importance in life of looking at what do I most long for inside? And that corresponds to the destination. And then every other decision you make is subject to that. What do I most want for?
Did you discover that in your life? Not only on the pilgrimage,
yes,
but
yes.
what did you discover for yourself, what your destination is in life?
Well, I knew where to look, for example, and look at your deepest longings. And you may want this, and you may want that, and you may want to be able to write books, etc. But it wasn't that. It was something, I could never quite get at it, but there was something drawing me. And the whole importance of desire. And that's why I go on a bit about the importance of desire in the book, God in All Things.
You write that you saw, that you glimpsed the unity of all things during that pilgrimage.
Well, it's just the merest glimpse. I mean, it wasn't a vision or nothing like that. It was in Scotland before I started the pilgrimage, and I was practicing. Was I capable of walking long distances, etc.? And it was one evening, I was fairly tired, and the wind was blowing, and the sky was a sort of multicolored sky. But watching these huge trees just bend in the wind, and somehow, hard to describe, but feeling at one with the bending trees, feeling at one, you know, the wind, same wind was blowing on me as on the trees. And the difficulty always is trying to put this into language which doesn't sound daft. But it wasn't daft, it was a great moment. And I think that unity of all things is something which has stayed with me and deepened.
In what aspect did it deepen? How did it
Well,
deepen?
for example, just looking at the people, all the different faces, all the different expressions, etc., that we are all one. And I spent some time living with Aboriginal people in Australia. And I never forget an interview with an Aboriginal. He was an artist, like most Aboriginal people, but his English was good. And the day before I met him, I'd passed a place called Mistake Creek. I think it was called Mistake Creek. And it was a burial place of about 30 Aborigines who had been shot by their white farmer owner because the white farmer had lost a cow. He suspected the Aborigines of having stolen it. Nobody owned up to it. So he came along with his stockmen and shot 30 of them. And the next day, the cow appeared. So they were shot by mistake. Now, this artist I met was of the group, the shot group, but he happened to be away that day. And I was asking him, I said, how do you cope with this? And we were sitting out in a garden outside his house, and he said, see sky, see sun, see trees, see birds, see you, see me, we all one. That was all he said. But I thought, that man has got a way of seeing things which saves him from all the bitterness and the nastiness and the violence. But he realizes the unity. The mystics have this in all their writings that was on it, this unity in God we live. And we're all in a unity far closer than we realize. And we are influencing one another in ways we don't realize.
In your book you write about practicing stillness.
Yes.
How do you see that?
Well, I think to practice it, in order to get used to it, one of the things in practicing stillness, you focus your attention on something, on your feelings in the body, for example. The physical feelings you're experiencing at this moment. And you keep your attention focused on that, or try to. And then you become aware how the mind flits from one thing to another. It can't stay on anything for long. And it's always either running into the future or looking towards the past. And it's the ability just to be still in that and not, as it were, go with rushing forward or rushing back. Just be still. And a good comparison is, imagine you're standing on a large bridge and there are barges going up and down the river. And you stand just looking at the barges, and some are beautiful and some are very attractive and some have lovely music and others are absolutely filthy and there's screams and shouts coming, etc. You observe them from the bridge, but you don't jump off the bridge to go into the barge. So inside us, it's as though we can take a stance on a bridge and we notice these thoughts and where they're taking us, but we don't go with the thoughts, we just notice them. And to be able to notice without having to rush after them, that's a great gift of being able to concentrate, for example.
And not to identify with our moods and feelings.
And not to, yes, identify with the moods. Say, the moods are there, but they're not me, as it were.
Who is me then?
I'm on the... Now, there is a most interesting question. Ultimately, who is me? We identify ourselves by things which are not us. You know, I come from Ayrshire, I am aged this, etc., and I've done this. But it's not really getting at the core of the I. And in Christian understanding, our ultimate identity is in God. Now imagine, you're saying, well, what's the practical point of all this? Imagine you're being interviewed on television. Yes, well, here we are. Say you suddenly turn nasty and you pointed out all my faults and failings and weaknesses for everyone to see and hear. And as we all well know, it's easy enough if you're being criticized falsely. But if you're criticized and the criticism is dead true, then it is excruciatingly painful. So imagine you suddenly turn on me and you point them all out, everyone to see. Then if I really believed with my guts in this presence of God, I could sit with my best half Zen smile. I could thank you at the end for your contribution to the truth. And I would feel no rancor, annoyance with you, whatever.
That doesn't sound like being human, does it?
It doesn't quite, but you hear all these things, but it's something that humans can become. You look at some characters who seem to have the Dalai Lama. When I look at him, when I hear him, he's a man who seems to be above all the sort of petty squabblings. I think of Nelson Mandela and so many of his pronouncements, Archbishop Tutu. You know, these men have been through absolute hell, and yet they're so gentle in their judgments, they're so good-humoured, etc. They found a stability, and the stability is coming out of a faith, a sort of realizing God is in all these circumstances. And again, in the Hebrew scriptures and in the New Testament, the most common phrase used of God is, or used by God is, "Don't be afraid, I am with you." today, it's a bit like having a supermarket of spiritualities. You know, which do you prefer? Do you prefer the sort of contemplative type of spirituality, or are you more an active person, like a bit of social justice as well? Which would you like? And this is just a general test on spirituality. Are they genuine or not? Because the spirit of holiness is God alone is holy. And therefore it's, how is God manifesting God's self? What's God interested in? Well, God is interested, yes, our prayers, and us praying, certainly. But also, how do we get on with one another? Human relations. And in the end, as far as Jesus' teaching is concerned, the ultimate test, where are we religiously? Jesus, it is extraordinary, that passage in Matthew chapter 25, where he gives the final judgment. And it's not about what religion are you, how many prayers do you say, do you go to the synagogue regularly? It's nothing of that. I was hungry, you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. And consequently, when I say my prayer is absolutely splendid, and you've suggested, well, perhaps look at your relations with your own immediate circle, because if it's the grace of God at work, it must affect those. Can't be just your prayer. And I tell you that I've just disregarded them. And I go off a little crestfallen after that. I'm not so bouncy as when I came in to see you, because you reminded me of this. But 3 months later, I come back, and I'm full of bounce again. And I say to you, I just came back to thank you for the enormous help you've given me. Do you know, I hadn't really seen it before, but you'll be glad to hear I am now totally reconciled with the rest of the family. And not only are we reconciled, we actually pray together and we work together. And we've all joined in work which God has blessed beyond our wildest dreams. Now, by this time, you should be getting a little curious, wondering, what is this wonderful work? And so you get round tactfully to asking me, what is it you're doing? And I tell you, well, I'm now director of an international export company. And I say, well, in the interests of world peace, we export personnel landmines so that countries can guard their own borders, so that we will have peace. Now, question, if the grace of God is working on someone, God is the spirit of life, the spirit of compassion, the spirit of love. Do you see that in personnel landmines, with what they do to the individual, what they do to children, what they do to later generations, because they get stuck in the ground, they go off any time. So God, a test of spirituality, the intrapersonal, what goes on in my prayer, its feelings, etc. Interpersonal, but also social, my social relationships, it will affect the grace of God.
So you just have to leave your job?
You might well have to. You might well have to, yes.
We pray for peace, and at the same time we wage war.
Yes.
Isn't it rather naive to believe in, let's say, the Sermon on the Mount rather than in nuclear deterrence?
Well, you have to choose for yourself on that. And just
the state chooses for me. The country I live in chooses for me.
But you live in a democratic country.
Well, yes. As long as votes make a difference, but sometimes decisions are taken for which I haven't voted,
yes,
and I'm not consulted.
And there are some decisions which are taken which not even the voters not included, not even Parliament in our country. We've had decisions taken about nuclear weaponry initially, which did not, it wasn't a vote of Parliament. It was a vote of an individual Prime Minister at the time. And the reason for the voting was, it was a prestige question.
So we are powerless.
No.
We as individuals are powerless.
This is raising a huge question, faith and ultimately what the faith is about. One needs to look at that. And the Sermon on the Mount seems so impractical.
Naïef.
And naive. But if you look at it a bit more closely, for example, that business of turn the other cheek, walk another mile, give your cloak as well. If you look at the context in which all that's said, for the Jew, the most mark of utter contempt for someone would be to strike them with the back of your hand. You would never strike them with your open hand. That would be a sort of desecration almost of your own sacredness. So with the back of your hand, you would hit them. Now, if I do that with my right hand to you, like that, and you suddenly turn the other cheek, it's quite difficult for me to work this way. I can't do it properly. Now, it's a tiny thing, but instead of hitting me back or shooting me or whatever, you actually turn the other cheek, and it makes me pause. It gives a moment of pause to think what I'm about. And there's a whole the power of non-violence. It requires enormous moral strength to do it, a deep faith to do it, but where people don't just hit back. And it has been on occasion so extraordinarily effective, and its history hasn't been written up. It's not mentioned much publicly. Second World War, remarkable cases of that, the effect of the non-violence. I believe in Denmark, for example, orders given that the Danes were all to summon the Jews and put yellow badges on them, the yellow star, and the whole population turned out, so I read, including the king, with yellow stars, sort of quiet resistance. Up in Norway, the teachers revolted. They just refused to accept this Nazi propaganda in the schools, and eventually the Germans gave way. But in this century, the number of cases, Gandhi in India, and the whole power of non-violence, and it's to touch into that power. It's the heart of the gospel. It's where this Spirit of God is something which is given to us as our spirit, and sometimes you say, well, is it God or is it me? And we don't know. It feels like me doing it, psychologically, but it's the way God works with us, because God doesn't, as it were, command us or use us as tools, calls us into partnership.
Gerard Hughes, thank you so much for the interview, and we brought a present. This is a book from the previous series, To Be a Pilgrim, and
yes.
interviews of persons in the
Very
same
good.
series.